I'm Mark Scott, and the presentation, the title is We Fought on D-Day. This is a photograph I took. The photographs in the book, which is available in about 50 minutes' time, I tried to take as many as possible using an original 1938 lens on a 1940 Leica 3C camera, which is a German camera, and all will become apparent. And if you can imagine that I was trying to have a look at the scene of something that has occurred, that would have been the camera that would have been used. It gives that appearance. So this is the original Pegasus bridge. It's now, some while ago, they had to widen the canal that it was on, and they lifted the whole bridge and put it in a museum nearby. So this is the actual original one, although it doesn't span the canal anymore. So We Fought on D-Day. Copy of the book, again, Ulstermen in Normandy in their own words. And there's a lad on the front cover, I'll tell you about him right now. And we also have then the church and tower at Ronville and the Commonwealth War, a view of the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery there. Basically, this came about 20 years ago. Brian Henry Martin from Double Band Films made a film documentary, which is going to be shown this Sunday night on BBC Two at 10 p.m. And it was titled We Fought on D-Day. And what Brian did, he had the foresight then to gather up as many veterans as he could. He found 8 then, and he interviewed them. And of course, now they've all passed away. If you think about it, then that was the 60th anniversary. The lads that on D-Day itself, they would have been in their late teens and early 20s. And now, of course, 20 years on, they're all gone. Brian offered up to me the unused interview material. You'll see when you watch the documentary, it's 50 minutes long, but around 20 hours of interview material was actually recorded. And that's how films are made. And everything that wasn't used in the 50-minute documentary ended up on the cutting room floor, as we say, but it actually wasn't on the cutting room floor. It was held and retained. It was actually in Betamax professional format. If anyone knows that, you'll be showing your age. And we had to figure out a way to get it put onto digital format so that I could then listen to it. So I've spent the last couple of years listening to this, transcribing it, and turning it into a book. Now, what I didn't want to do was just plagiarize Brian's film and give you a transcription of the film, because that wouldn't be very interesting, particularly if you're about to watch it. Or I didn't want to simply plagiarize and copy all of the interview text. Some of it, as men talk, they tend to ramble on a bit and then get back onto the subject. And so I had to sort of cut through and find some new things that came out of this. So the young lad, well, I'll go through first of all the 8 men themselves. Bill McConnell and Sam Lowry, they were 1st Airborne Royal Ulster Rifles. 8 men were interviewed, 7 were Royal Ulster Rifles. And an important fact that maybe you don't know and you should know, the Royal Ulster Rifles was the only British Army regiment to deploy 2 battalions, 2 regular battalions, 1 airborne and 1 seaborne. So the 2nd Battalion landed on Sword Beach on D-Day. The 1st Airborne Battalion landed by glider near Ronville, near the where the bridge that you saw at the start was. So these 2 lads, these 2 young lads, as they were then, Bill McConnell and Sam Lowry, they were 1st Battalion. Sam Lowry was a sergeant then, and Bill was a young private. He had actually lied about his age to join. Hamilton Lawrence, again, airborne. Jimmy Bowden, he was 591 Antrim Royal Engineers Para Squadron. And again, people will be thinking, who on earth were they? But I think it's important that we remember his unit. His job was to go in first. In April 1944, RAF reconnaissance flight picked up that the Germans had planted telegraph poles with explosives on the top in all of the likely or potential airstrips that gliders or aircraft could land on. So this was to try and deny that aspect of the invasion. So these had to be cleared. The guys couldn't go in gliders and clear them because they would be destroyed as they landed. So paratroopers had to go in. Jimmy Bowen did that job. Explosives were basically the type of charge they used was invented for the job. And it consisted of a bicycle inner tube filled with explosives with a detonator and some wad packing in it, and they were carried around the guys' necks. So they parachuted in. The idea was they'd put these explosives around the pole and detonate them, and down they would come and clear the way for the gliders. So that was all done before 3 a.m. on the 6th of June. Jimmy actually flew out about 11 p.m. out of southern England and parachuted in. He lost all his kit. When he landed, all he had was a knife. And again, you can read about that in the book. I'm not plugging here, but I have to get moving on. So yeah, he had a bit of an adventure right from the start. Marty Vance, Robert Loughlin from Ballyclare, Dickie Keegan, Richard Keegan from Lurgan, and Stanley Burrows from Castlereagh. I think we could maybe almost push him into Lisburn with the new boundaries because the family moved up into the Castlereagh Hills. At the time of the Second World War, he lived in the Loopland area of Castlereagh. So, as I say, these guys were all interviewed. These are stills from the interview footage. And they were interviewed over 2 or 3. They were interviewed actually, some of them about half a dozen times, but only twice maybe on film. And these are stills from the actual film footage. Stanley Burrows, in particular, came up with a couple of comments that when I looked into, I was able to uncover some new material that has only come to light through this. One particular story relates to the young lad on the front cover of the book. There's a guy called Jim Whitehorn. He came from East London. I'd noticed in the research quite a lot of the casualties were Englishmen, and a lot from the Republic of Ireland as well. So it wasn't, although they were the Royal Ulster Rifles, they weren't solely Ulstermen as such. Young Whitehorn, he came from Stepney in East London. On the 6th of June 1944, he was married and had a 9-month-old daughter called Doreen. Stanley Burrows made a comment, and he quite rightly stated that none of the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Ulster Rifles were killed on Sword Beach when they landed. Everyone got on the beach from the landing craft, and they got off the beach again, and none were killed. And then he added a little line, and he said, I'd heard that someone said that there were people lost at sea, but I can tell you no one was lost at sea. But that was his consciousness. That's what he knew because he landed on Sword Beach. But what he didn't know was, or wasn't aware of, was that a detachment of 12 men from the 2nd Battalion were taken away from the battalion. Young Whitehorn, you can see he's an MT fitter, so he was a mechanic. And typically these guys, they were mechanics, caterers, and they had, I'm assuming if there's 12 of them, they probably had 6 lorries. And these lorries were packed full of small arms ammunition, mortars, explosives, to resupply the battalion. And the idea was they would leave Southend on the morning of the 6th of June 1944 and land in Normandy on the 7th, the following day, and make their way inland to wherever the battalion was and resupply them. Now they were on a ship along with around 560 other invasion soldiers from different regiments, all doing the same thing. So this was like a second wave, and they were known as Landing Force L. So on the morning of the 6th of June, the convoy left Southend. And I checked the records, and I checked the regimental records, the regimental history, and the war diary for the 2nd Battalion. And Stanley Burrows was correct. No one was recorded as killed. There were about 10 wounded men from sniper fire and mortar fire as they made their way up the beach. They were second wave, so probably all the damage had been done by the first wave. However, I found then a record on the Commonwealth War Graves website that Whitehorn was killed, recorded as killed and missing in action on the 6th of June. In the official history of the Royal Ulster Rifles, he's recorded as being killed on the 12th of June. So he has 2 death dates. So you can lie about your age, but you can't really very often lie about your death because you're not there. So what has happened here? So I looked into it and I found this record. This was part of a group of 6 pages, handwritten by a captain called Ryan. Ryan was the reconnaissance captain. He landed an hour before the main body of the 2nd Royal Ulster Rifles. His other responsibility was of the headquarters company. So all the guys here you can see, and this is just one little bit of the last page, if you like, but you can see you've got drivers, regimental aid post, driver, medical officer, can't remember what that is, clerk, PR1 clerk, and then Whitehorn, who was the fitter. So these are all like specialist, not so much fighting men, but support. So they were part of the headquarters company. He had this list of names, and he was actually wounded at Combe-on-Plain, or as Stanley Burrows would call it, Combs Wood, which is a village that there was one battle which was in 2 parts, and again I'll go into that shortly. So he was wounded there, brought back on the 9th of June, and obviously had this still in his pocket, and over the years it has found its way into the museum along with relatives and whatever hand-in artifacts that belonged to their relatives who had fought. So it was in the RUR Museum, which can be studied, but it's not online, so it can't be studied by everyone, if you know what I mean. You have to go looking for it. So I found the note for Whitehorn. Now, it doesn't say there that he was killed or any death date, so we couldn't resolve that. But this number, 3211, I looked down all these numbers and I actually recognised one of them. I think it was a 392. And that corresponded to a number painted on the side of one of the landing ships. There's various types of landing craft tank, landing craft infantry, and then the little ones you see with the doors that go down, going right up to the beach. So I started to look at that, and I did various searches for this number 3211. I'm actually very pleased to say that one of the guys that did all the legwork on this is sitting in the audience, a guy called Michael Jackson, who knows his way around Kew and the National Archives like I know my way around my own house. So Michael started to pick up a lot of these files, and then I would direct him, and working between us, we were able to put together what exactly happened here. 3211 was the code name of a ship. It was a Liberty ship, which was built really quickly by the Americans, one of thousands, I believe, and they were brought over to take part in the invasion. And the name of the ship, that's the serial number for the purpose of the ops order, if you like, but the actual name was the SS Sambut. And when I started to look at what happened there, the SS Sambut was part of this convoy that left Southend at 6 a.m. And at 12 midday on the 6th of June, it was off the coast of Dover, and it was flying a barrage balloon. They had the barrage balloons up while they were at Southend to stop enemy aircraft from harassing them. As it passed Dover, the barrage balloon was still up. A Royal Navy destroyer escort, of which there were 4 escorting the convoy, came alongside and hailed the captain on a megaphone and asked him to lower the barrage balloon because it was silhouetted against the cliffs of Dover. There was a large 14-inch gun battery on the Calais coast, Cap Gris-Nez. My pronunciation is like Stanley Burrows's. And they had originally thought that this battery couldn't traverse quick enough to harass ships going up and down the channel. But on the 6th of June, probably with the aid of this silhouetted barrage balloon, they were able to lay the guns and range onto the SS Sambut. 4 rounds were fired, 2 struck the Sambut, and it appears Whitehorn, Jim Whitehorn, Edmund James, was killed instantly. You can go onto the Imperial War Museum website, and if you look on my book, the reference, this photograph is replicated in the book, and if you follow the reference and type in the number that's there, you can actually watch footage. And this is the SS Sandboot on fire at probably around 12:30 or so on the 6th of June 1944. You can see here there are other ships and what look like tenders trying to rescue men from the water. This incident, it was filmed by another ship in the convoy, and it represents the biggest single loss of life to the British Army on D-Day, believe it or not. The one single incident that represented the biggest loss of life. There were, I think, 136 men lost, killed, out of the 560 or so who were on board. The rest were rescued from the water. Because of the amount of ammunition and fuel and explosives that the ship was carrying, it just went up. And the captain immediately ordered the ship be abandoned. A lot of the men jumped off, still wearing their helmets, and broke their neck as soon as they hit the water, because the force of the water, the upward force of the water on their helmeted head, just instantly broke their necks. It's believed that Jim Whitehorn was killed instantly. He was initially recorded as missing at sea. Then months later, that categorization was changed, and we could see it again from the Q files that his category was changed to killed in action at sea. So someone must have witnessed him die, basically, and has made a statement. An incidence of missing, it happened quite a lot in the First World War, and they maintained the system in the Second World War. What would happen was anyone who was in hospital, who was wounded, they would be interviewed and asked, did they know anyone else who at that time was missing? And some of them would say, yes, I saw him. He was running here, he was running there, he was doing that. So someone must have seen Jim Whitehorn. At the time the shells struck, a lot of the men were queuing up in the mess to get fed, because it was just literally lunchtime, 12 midday. This is young Whitehorn. And when you work out the time, he would actually be the first rifleman across both battalions to be killed in action on D-Day. So I was able to track down his daughter. She was 9 months old, and she's now 80 years, 9 months old, giving away her age, Doreen, and was able to tell her about this, which was quite edgy, let's say. So again, this has all come out of Stanley Hunter's testimony. So this, again, general situation on the 6th into the 7th of June 1944. The first RUR landed round about here, landing zone N, LZN. That's where the gliders come in. You can see Pegasus Bridge, and there's another bridge nearby. It was nicknamed London Bridge at the time. So there's two bridges there. The most famous one, of course, is Pegasus now. That's the one we all know. And the 1st Battalion made their way through Ronville and then on to Longueval. And this arrow should actually, in the book, it actually points over here to St. Honorin. The 2nd Battalion, they landed on Sword Beach up here, made their way through Lyon-sur-Mer, Hermonville, Perrières-sur-le-Dan, where they stayed overnight, and they then made their way to Annecy before putting in an attack at Combe-en-Plan here, or Comswood, as the guys referred to it. The 1st Battalion at Ronville, Bill McConnell, who was the first photograph on the left of the group of two that I showed you. He was a young airborne Ulster rifleman then. As the guys made their way into Ronville, and they basically got their heads down in and around the church here and wherever they could. And then the next morning at dawn, they got up and started to make their way on in their advance. They didn't get very far before sniper fire came from the church tower here. You can see it's quite a strange tower. It's separate from the church. It's not the way we would imagine a church tower to be. Usually we have them joined on. And this is a separate one. It's its own structure. Jimmy Bowden, who was a 591 para squadron, he was actually getting himself together as well, getting himself up and ready to move. And he noticed the ground beside him started to fly up little pings. And he was actually being shot at by the sniper in this church tower, only he was the other side of the river. So the guy was having a good go at everyone. Bill McConnell, unfortunately, or fortunately for him, was also a sniper. So he was called up by his CO and told, get the man out of the church, that's your job. So Bill actually did. He shot the man down and they got him out of the church tower. And when they actually went into the tower to remove the body, they found 2 captured, wounded British paratroopers. And actually what was going to happen if Bill didn't get the man out of the tower, they were going to blow the whole tower up with a 6-pounder gun. So actually 2 men's lives were saved by that. Just to the left, out of the shot here, left of frame, is a little monument called the Airborne Memorial. It was actually made by Royal Engineers in June 1944 when this cemetery started to appear, once we started to get fatalities. Bill McConnell, after around 1992, came back every year and laid a wreath at the Airborne Memorial. That's where his point of remembrance was, if you like. Now, the guys making the film, when you watch the film on Sunday night, 10 p.m, BBC Two, the opening scenes show Bill McConnell at this memorial, given the oration, you know, they do not grow old as we that are left grow old, etc. And he's actually filmed laying the wreath. Now, Brian Henry Martin, the producer, filmed him. They finished filming, Bill did his thing, and they started to pack up their gear. And Bill walked away and lifted another wreath out of his kit bag that he had with him. And he walked away through the little gap in the wall here and went around the back of the main church building. Now, there's like the original church cemetery, if you like, was there. And there are graves, Commonwealth War graves, along the old perimeter wall, the original perimeter wall. You can see this side of it, but at the back side, there are graves along it. So Brian didn't really know Bill that well. He describes the guys, they had this sort of code of honor, you know, you don't talk about the war. And it took a while for Bill to break that down, or for Brian to break that down with Bill and to get the men to actually tell him what had happened and establish confidence really between the two of them. So Brian wasn't at that stage yet, and he watched Bill go over with this wreath and lay it at a grave and salute. And Brian was like, oh boy, should we be filming this? Our kit's all the way. We've missed a moment here, but what is it? We don't know. And what had actually happened was there is the unknown German grave. And that was the man who Bill had actually taken out. So, next then, on the other side of the river, we have the 2nd RUR. They made their way to the edge of a little village called Annecy. And in the distance, you can see the wood there along the horizon. That is Comms Wood, as they know it. So one company was detailed to put in an attack on Comms. They couldn't carry out a reconnaissance to the extent that they wanted to or needed to. The fields that you see are very much like they were then. Flat fields, but up to about neck high with corn. So it was a long 1,400 yard open dead ground that they had to cross. And they couldn't actually get any reconnaissance patrols in, and any that got anywhere close discovered that Comms had a 10-foot wall around it. On the other side of the wall, there was a wood, thick wooded area. So the CEO instructed that one company go in and have a go, basically, take comms. So one company did go in, and they discovered a U-shaped hole in the wall around the village, which would have been round about this location. This road here, you can just about see, was just a little track. It's not much more than a track now, to be honest. And this area here is now where the Common Plain Cemetery, Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery is, and there's a 2nd Battalion memorial there as well. But the guys went in, they went through the wall, and they were repulsed quite severely. And they took about 16 fatalities. The captain, Aldworth, he was killed, and 16 other men, actually, so 15 in total. And a number of wounded, quite a few wounded. Now, Stanley Burrows made the comment, he said, and one of the other guys, both of them made comments. Stanley said that Ian Harris, the CEO, the colonel, had told him that 4 men were left behind on the 7th of June, behind this wall, wounded. And when the battalion returned, because the battalion attacked again 2 days later in battalion strength with backup from the East Riding Yeomanry and who had Sherman Firefly tanks, the Royal Engineers and the Royal Artillery, and also artillery fire from the offshore naval vessels. So they went in on the 9th of June in a proper big attack and took the village. And Stanley stated that when the village was taken on the 9th of June, the bodies of the 4 men who were left on the 7th were found in a ditch, and they each had a gunshot wound to the head. So at that point, they were prisoners of war. And what Stanley was basically saying was they'd been murdered. But what he was saying was hearsay. He was saying to Brian during the interview that Ian Harris told him. And by the ways of the military, Colonel Harris on the 7th of June, or the 9th of June for that matter, when he discovered this, would not have been summoned in Private Burrows and briefing him. You know, the two would not have crossed in that way. And this is probably something, reading between the lines, that came out at maybe an association dinner, maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years later. You know, and Harris has made this comment, and Stanley has picked it up. One of the other guys mentions it, but he says that Stanley told him. So again, it's hearsay. So where do we go from there? So I sort of thought, you know, if Stanley has come out with this, these guys were there. There must be something to it. But at the same time, it's quite a serious thing to be dealing with. So again, I took a visit to the Ulster Rifles Museum, and I found there a diary written by an officer called Cyril Rand. And Cyril Rand describes the first attack at Com, and he describes then the second attack on the 9th of June, and he states in the diary that when they returned on the 9th, they found the bodies of the 4 men who'd been left shot through the head, each with a gunshot wound. So they had been murdered. So we have a war crime. Kurt Meyer, war criminal, funny enough, of the 12th SS Panzer Division, was apprehended after the 12th SS Hitlerjugend were pushed out of the Falaise Gap a couple of months later. He was tried because as the Allied advance made their way down through Caen, they discovered a number of atrocities had been carried out by this unit. There was a statistic that I uncovered that actually most of the fatalities, and I'll show you the map again and you can see the breakdown, were inflicted on Canadians who were fighting alongside the British. They landed on Juno Beach, which was just beside Sword Beach. And the statistic that I found stated that of Canadian fatalities for the first 4 weeks fighting in Normandy, 1 in 6 were murdered in captivity as prisoners of war. And I thought, good grief, 1 in 6, that's a pretty serious proportion. So I then, Kurt Meyer was tried at Auric. in December 1944. He was found guilty of war crimes, sentenced to death, which was then commuted to life imprisonment, and he was released after something like 8 or 9 years and died a couple of years after that in the early 60s of natural causes. I think he took a stroke, actually. But during his trial, he was sat down at one point and shown this map, and this is a copy of a photograph of the original, which was taken by Michael there. And it shows, he was asked to pinpoint, for the benefit of the court, where his battalions were, where his manpower was. At that stage, on the 6th of June, he had a headquarters just at the north edge of Caen, around about here. It's directly opposite Caen Prison. You can go there and have a look. You can actually go in and you can buy pizza because it's not a pizza shop. So his headquarters was there in the pizza shop. Wasn't a pizza shop then, but his headquarters was there then. On the 7th of June, he moved it out to the Abbey d'Ardenne, which is here. And at that location, that was one of the locations where, after the advance passed through this area, the bodies of 18 Canadians were found buried in the grounds, and they'd either all been clubbed in the head or shot through the head, in a similar way to our Ulster riflemen. So he was asked to pinpoint where his men were on the 7th of June, and he made these 3 red lines here. Coms on plan, or Coms Wood, Com on plan, my pronunciation is rubbish, is here. And this was the 1st Battalion of his 25th Panzer Grenadiers. And the first, 2nd and 3rd, 1st, 2nd and 3rd beside each other. I've discovered in doing this research, and even World War I research, that when officers are planning battles, they deploy their men from right to left. So you've if you're looking at me, so 1, 2, 3, or A, B, C. They don't go left to right. And that's what happened here as well. So you have the 1st Battalion on the far right. The 21st Panzer Division, which were Rommel's old Africa Corps, were here. And on the 7th of June, Meyer moved his 3 battalions up, and the 1st Battalion of the 25th Panzer Grenadiers ended up in Combs Wood. So they were responsible, in my mind, for these 4 murders. Meyer was also then asked during his trial, and I pulled the whole trial transcript, because that's sort of weird person I am, and went through it. And he was actually asked then who was in charge of what and when. And he mentioned that Hans Waldmüller was the officer in charge of the 1st 25th Panzer Grenadiers. And he actually stated, and I think he might have been trying to build an alibi, that on the night of the 7th of June, he went to Com and he spoke to Waldmüller and he told him to dig in defensive positions. They were going to go defensive instead of continuing attack. So he actually puts himself there that evening, and he also then puts Waldmüller there. So by vicarious responsibility, again, I would put Waldmüller as directly responsible for the conduct of his men here. And one of the charges that Meyer was found guilty of was directing that prisoners were to be interrogated and then shot. And that was proven in his trial. So this was the mentality that the riflemen were up against. On the far side of the river, where we had Bill McConnell and the sniper, it was a different story. Allied fatalities that were left on the battlefield were later found, properly buried and properly marked and recorded. So they were like a different kettle of fish. And I think historically people tend to think as Rommel as more of a gentleman. But Kurt Meyer definitely wasn't. So Kurt Meyer indicated where his troops were. This then was the British Royal Ulster Rifles plan, a little planning map for the 2nd attack at Combs. And where the hole in the wall was, where the initial battalion went through, was round about here. Looking into exhumation reports from the Commonwealth War Graves, as I say, there were 16 men. There was the one officer called Allworth, and 16 men killed at the initial battle at Coms. And if we can say then 4 of them were actually murdered by the 12th SS, compare that to the Canadian statistic, we're now down to 1 in 4. They were running at 1 in 6. So the SS in this area were certainly up to the mark when it came to that. You have the railway halt here. The railway isn't there anymore. And this little dotted line, if you can remember the photograph I showed you, that was the road that was at the edge of the photograph in the initial slide. So that initial photograph was taken from up about here. This little road now, today, is called Avenue de Royal Ulster Rifle. And it leads to a little junction where the 2nd Battalion Memorial is, and then where Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery is. So the guys attacked, they'd moved further around into Annecy, and they attacked from a slightly different direction, as I say, with quite a lot of support, and took the village. And I believe, going by exhumation reports, that the bodies of the 4 men were found in this area. This is a photograph, quite a famous photograph. You've probably seen it in books and that. It is, of course, Ulster Rifleman. And the chap on the right is Cyril Rand. He was the guy that made the diary entry that I read. I contacted his family and obtained permission to use the extract in the book. The exhumation report then, as I say, there were 4 men I would say were murdered. 12 were killed in action. I discovered that 12 men were buried. The men were originally buried more or less where they fell, in and around the village. They were then moved in 1945, actually, and these exhumation reports were compiled to keep a track of what was found where and which body was moved where. So I discovered that 12 of the 16 were originally buried at a grid reference that was Coms, and 4 were actually buried at a place called Gazelle. That was about 3 miles away, and it was actually the location of the brigade headquarters. And I believe they were taken there for a post-mortem examination to determine what had actually happened to them when they'd been found in that way, knowing that they were prisoners. 2 of them actually, Valentine and Michael Ides, were stretcher bearers, so they would have been unarmed. And the other 2, Rogers and Mullen, I can't recall just at the minute where Rogers was from, sorry, but Mullen was Shankle Road lad. And you can see then that their death dates, which are here, 2 of them have actually been changed from the 8th to the 9th. The 9th being the day that the 4 were all found. So everything was corrected to that point. There's another record made by a sergeant, a medical sergeant. I was just talking to James about it earlier, and I think there's maybe someone here who can help with that, called James Drumgoole. And he recorded, if you as much as had a sniffle, he recorded it and wrote it down in the big old buff-coloured stationery office book. And he made meticulous records of casualties, woundings, fatalities, where it happened, the nature of the wound, etc. And this, again, was lodged and is in the Royal Ulster Rifles Museum. And if you talk to the curator there in a very nice way, you might actually get to look at it. But don't tell you I sent him, or I sent you. And again, when you look through his Drumgoole's record, it's known as the Drumgoole Roll. And when you look through the roll, again, you can see just discrepancies in how these guys' deaths were recorded and the dates on which they were recorded. So these are the 4 men that I believe were killed. Each one has this strange number, which I've never, and Michael hasn't either. We've both tried to find the source of these reference numbers. It begins with SSP, and then C, which I believe stands for Calvados, and then NWE, Northwest Europe, and then a number, a consecutive number. SSP, I don't know, SS prisoner, we don't know. We cannot find the source of these files. So the 2nd Battalion Memorial is here, just at the edge of the wood, where the wall would have been. There's no trace that, well, at the far edge of the village, there's a little stretch of about 50 or 60 yards of original wall. This is, as I say, at the little junction, which would have been a railway crossing, a level crossing. The railway's now gone, and the road out to the left here, this way, is Avenue de Royal Ulster Rifles. The locals have named it that. And the cemetery is just to your right, off screen. There's very few Ulster riflemen buried in that cemetery, actually. Most of them, like from the exhumation report, were buried at La Deliverande Cemetery. And it's one of the guys interviewed, actually, he was quite saddened. He went back on the 60th anniversary. There was a big ceremony in Caen, and he was brought back and introduced to the mayor, the Marie. And the Marie said, you know, once he heard he was an Ulsterman and he had actually liberated Caen, Hammy Lawrence, which he did. You know, a lot of this has been, without sort of talking overshot, but a lot of the commemoration here has been sort of taken over by the parachute regiment, you know, and they seem to have laid claim to it all. And over the years, a lot of people don't realise that the Ulster Rifles were there, let alone the 2 battalions. So the mayor was amazed at this and said, right, what do you want? And he said, I want to go to Common Plain and I want to see my mates' graves. And he actually describes that he was saddened when he got there because they weren't there, and they'd actually been moved to La Deliverande. This then is the 1st Battalion Airborne, 1st Airborne Battalion Memorial at Longueval, on the other side of the river. And again, these were established in 1992, and it was actually Bill McConnell, the sniper, and Stanley Burrows who made these comments. They were instrumental in getting the land off the locals and actually getting the stonework and everything installed. They came up against, it's fair to say, some opposition from within their own, let's say, but they pushed through that and they had these 2 memorials established together. And they're now a point of remembrance. I believe the Royal Irish will be out there this week paying their respects at these locations. And this is my contribution. So thank you all for coming this evening to hear about it. Thank you.
I hope I'm not being too cheeky in asking the first question, Mark, but could you maybe just explain a bit more about the gliders? A lot of people know about, you know, ordinary aircraft and stuff, but you know, obviously those that landed on the beaches, some either a ship or a landing craft. But what were the gliders?
The gliders, there were 2 types of gliders. There was a Hamilcar glider, which, let's just say, was big, and it was big enough where they could actually transport light tanks. The idea was that in any airborne or paratroop or glider-borne landing, the troops themselves, when you think about it, you're starting off from a position where you're surrounded. Usually that's the end game, but you know, the airborne forces start off by being surrounded. And it's important that they get as much firepower there as they can carry. Bear in mind that they're restricted to what they can actually carry on their backs if they're paratroopers, or bring in these gliders. And the gliders, it was decided that they would be better because as I say, the Hamilcar could take actually a small tank, and the Horsa glider, which was the one used by the 1st Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles, they were in 3 configurations. They could either take 28 men with kit, or they could take a jeep with a trailer full of ammunition, and usually, in their case, mortar shells for the mortar teams, and 8 men. Or they would take a jeep and a 6-pounder gun for anti-tank use. So when they landed, they had an anti-tank capability. They had groups of 28 infantry, if you like, and they also had then a means of transport with the jeeps and resupply of small arms ammunition and mortar shells, so that they also had, an extra artillery capability. So it was deemed that this was better. The actual construction of them, I have a number of photographs in the book that were taken at the Pegasus Bridge Museum in Normandy. They have a mock-up of a glider there, and they also have actually a section of fuselage from an original that they lifted out of a field, I would imagine. And you can look at the photographs in the book. Again, another plug, and have a look there. But that was the thinking behind it. You could deploy a larger amount of soldiers with a little bit of artillery along with them. The gliders themselves, they were more or less paper and wood, not much more to them, very little in the way of controls, and they were towed by Dakota planes. And then at a certain point across the channel, the tug plane detached the rope, and the glider had 2 pilots on board, and they had to try and get the men onto landing zone N, north of Ronville, which they actually did very successfully. I've seen aerial photographs where you can see where they've all landed, and they're all bang on target.
Was that first attack by the 16 men, was that the need for speed, really?
It was lack of intelligence, lack of knowledge. As I say, they didn't know the 12th SS were there to begin with. There was no indication of who was there. The original plan was that these guys, both battalions, and it's actually, you can see this in the RUR Museum, and I spoke about it with James just an hour ago. All these guys were given bicycles. So the guys getting off the landing craft at Sword Beach had bicycles. Jimmy Bowden, who was parachuting down, had a bicycle, a fold-up bicycle, and everyone, and the idea was they would all land and they'd all cycle into Caen and take Caen. Like, come on, really? And actually, when you read the book, every one of them has his own story of how he got rid of his bicycle. Jimmy Bowden threw his out of the airplane. Stanley Burrows, it went over the side of the ship. And all these bicycles, it was like, what? Really? They'd 70 pounds of weight to carry and a bicycle, so yeah. So the original idea was that they would take Caen in, I think, 3 days. And it actually took them into the second week of July, 44, before they took. 2nd Battalion were the first battalion to liberate Caen. Bill McConnell actually was one of the first men in Caen on the 7th of June. The story's in the book. He went in with a captain and 4 others in the back of a truck driven by a French resistance man in a reconnaissance mission. And they stayed in Caen for about 20 minutes and then got out. They had discovered that there was a large garrison there, and there's evidence on the brigade level war diaries, which are higher level than the battalion ones, that intelligence was actually shared between that side of the river and this side of the river. And it was probably that intelligence that decided that the plan would be changed, and they wouldn't go for a cycle into Caen. They would take it over a bit more time, which is what they did. So yeah, some interesting things I didn't know about. And, again, James asked me, am I a historian? No. I'm sure there are people here with history degrees. No, I'm not one of those people. But it's fair to say my knowledge, I described it to him as sort of narrow and deep. And I get these things and I look at them, and it's probably the same with my last 2 publications. They're along the same lines. So, if you ask me anything else in history, 1066, guy got hit in the eye with an arrow, that sort of thing. But
sorry, was there any issues getting access to Royal Ulster Rifles archives or records? Were they cooperative?
Yeah, no, they were okay. Obviously, over the last 10 or 12 years, I've built up my relationship with them. Gavin Glass down there is the current curator. They have issues, obviously, like any museum, with causing damage to them. They have to be examined in a particular way. But no problem.
Was there any private collections that you were able to consult?
Yeah, I couldn't find any of the Cyril Rand's diary. There was a copy of it in the Ulster Rifles Museum. I didn't want to use a copy, I wanted to use an original. And I contacted his family, chap in England, and basically confirmed what was in the diary from the original. But the copy was in the RER Museum, you know, but again, it's how do you know these things exist? You know, if there's a diary in someone's drawer and they know about it, I don't know about it, you know, but so you have to go with what you know. There was a couple of other diaries that I relied on in different aspects. The killing of the 4 guys, there was a Canadian from the East Riding Yeomanry. That's the other thing. I looked at not just the Royal Ulster Rifles, but who all was along with them. So you had the East Riding Yeomanry, and they witnessed a guy getting led away by SS soldiers along with 1 Ulster rifleman. And again, these are significant things. And there was also a dispatch rider from the East Riding Yeomanry, and he actually made the comment that after the attack on the 7th, that he wrote in his diary that they've killed some of our men, they've killed some of our prisoners. And he actually makes the comment that, you know, we'll have revenge. And again, that when you put it in context and his role as a dispatch rider, maybe he was privy to information that Stanley Burrows, for instance, wasn't privy to until years later. So, yeah, you know, I've dug out a couple of private, but it's finding them and knowing about them. You know, that's the thing. You know, there's no big central catalogue.